should come on, yep. Thank you very much, Phelan, and thanks to the Planning Committee. I guess I should stand over here. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. That's fine, okay. And thank you to the Planning Committee for inviting me. I look forward to a very stimulating day. The committee has asked that I comment on major social welfare and social work development during the past half century, including comments on themes that will be the subject of breakout sessions later in the day, although the sessions will be more specific. The broad themes that I've been asked to speak to are poverty in America, criminal justice, and evidence-based practice. I am happy to do so, especially since this time overlaps with my own social work career, which began in 1962. My presentation will take about 50 minutes, and I look forward to substantive and critical discussion because I think some of the things that I will have to say will be a bit controversial. At the macro level during the past half century, there has been major societal conflict, economic and social upheaval, growing threats to social and economic justice, racial and ethnic and religious divisions, and large-scale failures of government to function in the best interest of citizens. Risch identifies emerging social policy issues, including economic globalization, population migration, demographic and cultural diversity, climate change, terrorism, welfare reform, crisis in the financing of entitlements, the privatization of social policy, and the transformation of the welfare state. At both a global and national level, these developments and others have challenged those entrusted with social policy development and implementation. All three branches of the U.S. federal and state governments have responded to these challenges by forming or reforming social policies or failing to act, which in itself becomes a policy statement. At the micro level, the past half century has been a time of radical change. Social workers have been challenged to cope with new social problems emanating from the macro system dynamics that I've just mentioned, as well as being challenged to cope with old social problems in innovative interventions in new, evolving, technology-rich, client-centered, and service delivery systems demanding accountability, efficiency, and effectiveness. I will comment about developments at the macro policy level and then move on to developments at the micro policy level. Social work is fundamentally concerned with basic social welfare values that foster what James R. Dumpson has called a caring society. As P. Nelson Reed proposes, in such a caring society, there will be a moral obligation to bring about fruition of social welfare conditions that provide opportunities for work and human meaning and a reasonable amount of security from want and assault, promote fairness and evaluation based on individual merit, and be economically productive and stable. Notable progress has been made in the nation's move toward a caring society during three periods: the Progressive Period, the New Deal, and the New Frontier Great Society. As Reed notes, it was during the Progressive era from about 1890 to 1920 that the bulk of the agenda of social development that dominated the 20th century, from race and gender to public health and slum clearance, was developed. Most notably, it was during this time that the model of social insurance, as contrasted with charity, was instituted, albeit at the state rather than at the national level, including Mother's Aid and workmen's compensation. And it was in the context of the Great Depression of the 1930s that the New Deal programs were crafted. For the first time, social insurance was provided at the national level with the passage of the 1935 Social Security Act, which provided for federally administered entitlements for the working middle classes and state-run means-tested programs for the poor. The Act provided for pensions, unemployment insurance, and aid to blind, deaf, disabled, and dependent children. Much of the debate, at least since the mid-1970s, the Reagan era, has focused on modification of the provisions of the 1935 Social Security Act and its subsequent amendments, especially assaults on provisions for the poor, or the so-called welfare class. The New Frontier and the Great Society of the 1960s moved beyond issues of economic security attained through defined benefits to attack those structural social conditions which prevented minorities and the poor from full participation in American life. This was a period of civil rights and social reform, especially at the community level, with an emphasis on creating opportunities for maximum feasible participation of minorities and the poor in policy and program development, as well as implementation. Legislation was passed to combat discrimination and to foster voting rights for all citizens. The 1960s was a period of relative prosperity, enabling the large-scale social investments in social programs to enhance opportunity and full participation. For social work, this was a period of expansion and promise, especially because the need for social work personnel who were authorized to provide social services for a wide variety of citizens, including those receiving aid to families with dependent children, or AFDC, under the 1962 amendments to the Social Security Act. To a large extent, the last 40 years have witnessed an attack on the social policy accomplishments of these three eras: the Progressive Era, the New Deal, and the New Frontier Great Society. For much of this time, a social and economic conservative ideology has dominated American politics, fueled by the specter of scarce resources. This ideology has exalted private markets, limited government, supremacy of states over the federal government, advocacy of lower taxes, and support for cuts in social spending. Reed observes, this conservative ideology moved the nation toward work-based and work enhancement programs, privatization, individualism, and federalism. And as Stewart notes, beginning in the late 1970s, and especially in the 1980s and the 1990s, limits to the growth of the welfare state became apparent in the context of increasing energy costs and economic slowdown. This retrenchment of the welfare state became worldwide in the 1990s through the present. In his history of social work and social welfare from 1980 to 2014, Michael Reich describes this period, and I quote, "Economic globalization and technological developments have fundamentally altered the nation's political economy, the nature of work, and the economic prospects of millions of Americans. The U.S. political system has become increasingly polarized on ideological grounds, and the electoral process has changed as a consequence of the influence of money on politics. Demographic and cultural shifts, particularly the aging of the population, the growth portion of racial and ethnic minorities in the U.S., especially in urban areas, the expansion of women's and LGBT rights, and the increase in the number of children born outside of marriage have created new social problems or challenges. As distrust of government has become more widespread, market-oriented ideas and values have permeated the culture of nonprofit and public sector organizations. New unprecedented issues also emerged during this period, such as the HIV/AIDS epidemic, crack cocaine, pervasive and chronic homelessness, terrorism, and the effects of climate change. The focus of social welfare policy shifted from the expansion of legal entitlements to concerns over fiscal responsibility, and from protection of the vulnerable populations to an emphasis of work over welfare. The consequences of early 21st century Great Recession from December of 2007 to June of 2009 exacerbated long-standing political and social conflicts and created new sources of tension in U.S. society, particularly over the future of domestic policy. I turn now to micro-level developments. Social work, and the theme really is that I'm going to play out here, is social work's evolution from moral imperatives to evidence-based practice. Ockpuck and Yu recently published an account of social work's evolution through 3 phases, during which intervention was based in the first phase on moral imperatives, a second phase during which intervention was based on authority, and the most recent phase, which they refer to as empirical. The empirical phase, spanning the last half-century, is viewed as encompassing the empirical practice movement and, as most recently, the evidence-based practice movement. I'll comment on each of these phases briefly. The moral phase. The Settlement House movement, the Charity Organization Society, or COS movement, and the Association for Improving the Conditions of the Poor, or AICP, were motivated by moral imperatives. In the case of settlements, to, quote, correct class division and violations of the American ideal of democracy by infusing culture and resources into communities on the social fringe. And in the COS movement, quote, and you recall these organizations were the founders of the profession to a large extent and the founders of this school. In the COS movement, quote, to prompt a moral transformation within poor households, a moral transformation. The AICP was based on the belief that poverty was due to some moral fault of the poor, and the AICP's aim was to help the, quote, deserving poor by providing for their moral uplift. The authority phase, second phase. Ockbeck and Yu note that as social work matured, morphing into a profession, there was a growing awareness that social work needed to be based on more than a moral imperative. Accordingly, the mid-1910s through the 1930s was a period of professional instability, and concerted effort was directed toward articulating a unique function and technique for social work. What emerged was a new worldview of and template for social work practice based on authority. The two strategies used to activate authority-based practice were the formalization of social work practice methods and the importation of psychoanalytic theory. Ockbeck and Yu believe that the authority-based movement ushered in a mode of practice organized around conceptual appeal, reputation, and endorsement by the professional community. The third and last phase, the current phase, they describe as the empirical foundations. Beginning in the 1960s, developments contributed to a reshaping of social work, causing a shift away from authority-based practice toward what is now called evidence-based practice. First, social work educators expanded the profession's foundation knowledge by importing social science theories and methods, in addition to the psychoanalytic framework. As a consequence, students were increasingly exposed to a wider range of theoretical and disciplinary perspectives with decreasing reliance on psychoanalytic frameworks. Second, the programs fostered by the New Frontier, the Great Society, and the War on Poverty of the 60s forced social work to compete with other professions and paraprofessionals in the delivery of services, and required social work to stretch its methods beyond traditional psychoanalytically based interventions, to invest in community-based methods and empowerment strategies. And third, social work interventions were put to the test of effectiveness, especially interventions designed to prevent or ameliorate problems of poverty and delinquency. By the beginning of the 1970s, social work practice began a major transformation. Its knowledge base had been strengthened by the addition of social science frameworks, yet the profession's relevance and credibility had been brought into question due to the changing societal context and growing skepticism about the effectiveness of its services. One response by many in the profession was to call for strengthening the science base of the profession. Accordingly, to a considerable extent, from 1960 to the present, social work has been engaged in efforts to strengthen its scientific foundations by collaborating with other disciplines, by engaging in intervention research designed to build data-based interventions, by adapting emerging technologies, and by experimenting with ways to productively bridge the so-called practice research gap. During the last 15 years, social work, together with virtually all of the helping professions, has been experimenting with a new policy and practice framework which combines those elements that I've just mentioned into a single science-based framework evidence-based practice. Ockpick and you refer to this phase of professional development as a shift to an empirical paradigm. I want to turn now, with this broad background at the micro and macro level, to talk about what I see as 21st century challenges. Having outlined some of the more significant macro and micro level developments affecting social work during the last half century, I now turn to current issues and challenges emerging from those developments that I think demand social work's foremost attention. I limit my comments to 3 areas, which more or less will be the focus of subsequent sessions during this conference: poverty, criminal justice, and evidence-based practice. Poverty, a core concern of the profession. No single social problem is as central to social work as that of poverty and all of its consequences. Yet, as Marcia Myers observes, quote, "It is difficult not to wonder why, given all the thought, resources, and effort that have gone into the study of poverty, we seem to have made so little progress toward answering the questions of why poverty persists in an affluent United States, and importantly, what we can do about it." She infers that one answer to this question of why so little progress has been made is a lack of clear and persuasive understanding of the causes of poverty and relevant solutions. Myers concludes that, quote, "Successful policy reform efforts need a persuasive intellectual narrative about the nature of the problem and what can be done to solve it." I agree with Myers' observations, and accordingly, I now turn to 3 questions about poverty in America that I think still need clear thinking if there is to be a persuasive narrative. First, how should poverty be conceptualized? As social work's history demonstrates, how poverty is conceptualized affects social interventions. It does affect social interventions. In the 19th century, when poverty was considered a moral issue, moral interventions were used to assist the deserving poor, and coercive measures were used with the undeserving poor. During the Depression of the 1930s, poverty was associated with lack of jobs and loss of income due to widowhood, disability, and old age. Accordingly, federal programs were established to provide income and jobs. In the 1960s, poverty was conceptualized as resulting from a lack of opportunity, exclusion from civic participation, and discrimination, so a wide range of programs were put into place to expand opportunities, to maximize participation, and to combat discrimination. Michael Harrington's book, The Other America, Poverty in the United States, published in 1962, provided an influential conceptualization of poverty, which was an impetus for the War on Poverty of the 60s. In a noteworthy shift of mission, a founding organization that I was associated with, a founding organization of the social work profession and of the Columbia School of Social Work, the Community Service Society of New York, conceptualized urban social problems in terms of interconnected clusters of social conditions affecting whole neighborhoods, such that urban poverty was redefined by CSS as a condition of neighborhoods, especially neighborhoods populated by racial and ethnic minorities, with high prevalence of substance abuse and other social problems. Accordingly, in 1972, CSS, front page of the New York Times, CSS announced that it was dropping social casework as an intervention in favor of community-level interventions and advocacy focused on urban poverty so defined. This continues to be CSS's strategy after 45 years. Currently, there is much discussion of how poverty should be conceptualized and measured. Sen views poverty as capability deprivation, such that poverty is not just low income, which is what we usually think of, but also involves a lack of basic capabilities to participate fully in society. This is a view that is very prevalent in many of the Northern European countries. Hills and others conceptualize poverty as social exclusion, which is defined as a lack of income, lack of employment, political and community disenfranchisement, and the inability to participate in the activities of everyday life. And policy and practice implications flow, I believe, from whether poverty is viewed as an absolute or a relative condition. Currently, much attention is being given to the growing disparity of income or wealth among social classes, which has important social consequences. Today's New York Times has an interesting article about the shrinking of the middle class and the expansion in some areas of the upper class and the lower classes. And this is not a one-time event, it's a trend. For social workers, then, I believe that how poverty is conceptualized is fundamentally important, not as an intellectual exercise, but because alternate views, to a large extent, do shape policy and practice options selected. I look forward to discussion of this point. I turn next to how can poverty be explained. As Ronk notes, explanations have been proposed which point to individual deficiencies as well as the culture that the individual resides in, or alternately, as due to economic, social, and or political structures of a society. Individual level and cultural explanations of poverty have emphasized the causal role of counterproductive attitudes, behaviors, or motivations that cause poverty. Social welfare policy and program disincentives that are believed to reduce motivation for work, the lack of individual human capital, and culture as a major mechanism that keeps families in poverty. Oscar Lewis's The Culture of Poverty was an influential example of the cultural explanation. Lawrence Mead's Beyond Entitlement, the Social Obligation of Citizenship, invokes the explanation that poverty results from social welfare disincentives and Elizabeth Sawhill's The Behavioral Aspects of Poverty proposes that poverty can be attributed to individual behaviors such as dropping out of school, early childbearing, remaining unmarried, and failure to work full time. Alternately, as Ronk notes, structural explanations of poverty focus on, and I see I didn't move my slide. We're going back, that's why. You have to push the bottom key rather than the top key. Did I have that one up? I had that, okay. That's where we are now, okay. Alternately, as Ronk notes, structural explanations of poverty focus on the economic, social, and or political structures of a society as major reasons for poverty. In this type of explanation, poverty is a consequence not of individual deficiencies, but of the failure of economies to produce sufficient opportunities, deficits in the political and social welfare structures, discrimination, cumulative disadvantages, or the wider societal functions served by the poor. For example, William Julius Wilson describes how political, economic, and other structural forces impact impoverished inner-city black neighborhoods. Herbert Gans, using Robert Merton's functional analysis, proposes that poverty serves a number of latent societal functions, especially for the upper classes, and accordingly, that phenomena like poverty, quote, can be eliminated only when they become dysfunctional for the affluent or powerful, or when the powerless can obtain enough power to change society. Gans. Of course, one's view about the causes of poverty and how one explains the persistence of poverty in the midst of affluence are closely intertwined. Lastly, what poverty group should be the focus of social work interventions? Since the mid-1970s, surprisingly, the U.S. poverty rate has remained nearly constant. About 15% of all Americans have incomes at or below the conservative federal policy threshold. Poverty rates dropped considerably from the late 50s through the end of approximately 1973, 1974. And since then, while there's been fluctuation, approximately 15% on average have remained as poor. However, this generalization does not apply to the most disadvantaged groups in American society. Mark Rank calls attention to those groups at higher risk of impoverishment, which include, of course, children and the elderly, single-parent female-headed families, women, non-whites, especially African Americans and Hispanics, and those residing in economically impoverished geographical areas, such as Appalachia, the Mississippi Delta, and urban ghettos. Because poverty has been shown to have long-range consequences for children, children experiencing extended poverty, sometimes defined as 4 years approximately, are especially at risk for long-term detrimental outcomes. Nichols, examining poverty rates in the U.S., describes historically high overall poverty rates for some vulnerable groups, especially for children and especially for black children. Deep poverty rates are especially high among non-Hispanic blacks and Hispanics, as well as among unmarried female-headed households. I've stressed the importance of being clear about how poverty in America is conceptualized and explained, as well as what groups in society are most affected. Depending on one's understanding of poverty and the most vulnerable populations, alternate strategies for alleviating poverty may be considered, such as reforming the social safety net and the welfare state, increasing support and services to low-income households, asset building, economic and job creation, and economic development and micro-enterprise strategies. For social workers, this background knowledge, together with a clear sense of professional mission and values, should suggest strategies for alleviating poverty and improving the American social welfare system. The second topic I want to touch on is criminal justice. And some of you will be talking more specifically about this in follow-up sessions. Recent events have triggered widespread debate and concern about what is perceived by many to be a deepening crisis in the nation's criminal justice system. Many see the crisis as fueled by a series of so-called tough-on-crime initiatives, beginning with the Omnibus Control and Safe Street Acts of 1968, the Rockefeller drug laws of 1973 in New York State, and most recently, the 1994 Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act, signed by President Clinton. It is generally acknowledged that while these policies may well have contributed to a reduction in violent crime in some areas of America, the tough-on-crime laws have also contributed to unprecedented numbers of people being imprisoned, as well as growing antagonism between community residents and police. A recent New York Times op-ed editorial notes, quote, "The growth in the nation's population, in the nation's prison population, has been nothing short of staggering. The United States incarceration rate is now more than 4 times the world average. 4 times the world average, with about 2.2 million people in prisons and jails. Of those, roughly 200,000 are federal inmates, double the number of 20 years ago, double the number of people in prison, federal prisons than 20 years ago. This substantial increase occurred even as violent crime was falling sharply. As noted by Margaret Severson in 2013, more total persons and more women are incarcerated in the United States than in any other country in the world. The number of persons under supervision of the U.S. correctional system has been rising since the early 1970s, despite decreases in total numbers in 2007 and 2008, and despite decreases in violent crimes since 1991, with a few exceptions. According to a 2014 Human Rights Watch, so-called tough-on-crime laws adopted since the 1980s have filled U.S. prisons with mostly nonviolent offenders. Black and Hispanic males are especially affected by the inequities often cited. Black men have been incarcerated at increasingly disproportionately high rates before leveling off in the early 2000s. Often forgotten about are the children and the partners of those incarcerated, especially how incarcerations affect the lives, present, and future of family members. According to Yvette Harris, an estimated 1.7 million children have parents in the criminal justice system, and more than 10 million young children have experienced the incarceration of one or more parents and patterns of familial incarceration. African American children represent 53% of that number. 53%. For these children, there is concern about the effects of incarceration on developmental and clinical outcomes, basic rights, and the loss of parental custody. The after effects of incarceration on those imprisoned, as well as their families, is too often not addressed. Once arrested and/or incarcerated, some 70 million Americans are marginalized by exclusion from jobs, housing, higher education, Pell Grants, consumer credit systems, voting, and other sources of support and participation. For example, by some estimates, 1 in 13 African Americans are unable to vote because of their criminal justice system status as felons. High rates of incarceration, especially among racial and ethnic minorities, as well as heightened citizen police tension at the community level, are among the most critical issues demanding macro-level attention. Indeed, one expression of that tension is the alarming number of people killed by police officers. According to a report by The Guardian, there were over 1,000 deaths in the United States at the hands of police officers in 2015. Black men were 9 times more likely than other Americans and 5 times more likely than comparable white males to be killed by police officers. In recent years, there have been stunning instances of such killings, oftentimes of unarmed and innocent citizens of color by police and armed citizens, assuming law enforcement functions. In the aftermath of these killings, many have called for a careful review of policies and practices fostering police and citizen conflict. David Yaski, counsel to the House Subcommittee on Crime, who drafted the 1994 crime bill signed by Bill Clinton, recently called for re-imaging prisons and, as much as possible, replacing them. Re-imaging and replacing prisons, just as we did to a large extent with the institutionalization of the mentally ill. The next evolution in criminal justice policy, he writes, must be to reform our correctional system, and we must start by restoring rehabilitation as the goal, not punishment. We should make much greater use of parole, halfway houses, and other forms of supervised release. We also need to devote far greater resources to mental health services. Under the administration of President Obama, significant steps have been taken to reform the criminal justice system, such as the establishment in 2011 of the Federal Interagency Reentry Project, which coordinates reentry efforts of 20 federal agencies and promotes effective reentry policies. President Obama's budget proposal is prioritizing reforms over punishment. Reforms over punishment. The new 21st Century Justice Initiative program, which is part of a $29 billion request for the U.S. Justice Department for the year beginning October 1, 2016, has 3 objectives: reduce crime, reverse policies that cause unnecessary long sentences and unnecessary incarceration, and build community trust in the justice system. While this and similar initiatives such as Federal Interagency Reentry Project holds promise, it remains to be seen what will be enacted given current political polarization. Social workers provide the majority of treatment services for correctional institutions and for criminal justice-involved populations, especially the most vulnerable groups, including women who have experienced trauma, the children traumatized by having parents in the criminal justice system, and the mentally ill, individuals with substance abuse problems, including comorbidity, and racial and ethnic minority populations. Our system traumatizes too many people. Social workers have unique skills that can be used to limit incarceration, as well as to assist individuals and families reintegrate following incarceration. It seems right that given their intimate knowledge of the needs and problems of those involved in the criminal justice system, social workers should be among those calling for reform, and such reform should include efforts to ensure that services provided are data-informed and evidence-based, both at the macro and the micro levels. Lastly, a few words about evidence-based practice. As I have already noted, evidence-based practice is arguably the most significant development affecting micro-level social work during the last half-century. And it has also had a significant impact on social work education and macro-level practice. This slide illustrates that evidence-based practice is a generic process in which practitioners systematically seek out, assess, and use best evidence to select client-appropriate interventions that have been tested for effectiveness, and with this information in hand, engage in informed decision-making with clients about intervention options. This process can be used at all levels of social work, including at the clinical level and at the policy level. In 1999, when Professor Eileen Gambrell at Berkeley brought evidence-based practice to the attention of social workers, 1999, few references could be found to evidence-based practice in the social work literature. In that seminal article, she called for replacing what she called authority-based practice with evidence-based practice. Gambrell called for transforming social work practice by adopting the newly developed evidence-based medicine model, which had been developed and promoted in the health professions during the prior decade. In 2003, one of Gambrell's students, Leonard Gibbs, published the first social work evidence-based practice textbook, 2003. Together with David Schreiner, in 2004, I proposed that, like most innovations, evidence-based practice would be resisted and initially rejected in social work, but that once it had taken hold, the naysayers would join the bandwagon, and some even claim ownership. Since those early days, it now seems that evidence-based practice has indeed taken hold in social work, as well as in allied disciplines. Indeed, evidence-based practice has become the new social work practice framework. Some would say the new social work paradigm. Two recent examples serve to make my point. The 12 Grand Challenges for Social Work recently issued by the American Academy of Social Work and Social Welfare is a call to action to tackle America's toughest social problems, powered by science. In nearly every one of the challenges, there is a call for using scientific evidence to enhance individual and family well-being, strengthen the nation's social fabric, and create a just society for all. Recently, a second example is the Institute of Medicine released an influential report proposing recommendations for establishing efficacy standards for psychosocial interventions for the treatment of the mentally ill and substance use disorders. The IOM report concludes that, 1, psychosocial interventions that have been demonstrated to be effective in research settings are not used routinely in clinical practice. 2, no standard system is in place to ensure that psychosocial interventions delivered to patients or consumers are effective. In her commentary on the IOM report, Dr. Myrna Weissman, one of 3 social work members of the IOM committee drafting the report, notes, quote, "The focus was on evidence-based care, and the long-term goal was that all psychosocial interventions be grounded in evidence." Dr. Weissman suggests that because of the Mental Health Parity and Addiction Equity Act of 2008, as well as the Patient Protection and Affordability Care Act of 2010, Obamacare, there is expectation that the number of persons with mental health problems able to receive care will expand. And accordingly, the IOM study was undertaken to create a framework to assure that those psychosocial interventions provided are indeed evidence-based. These then are examples of how, in a relatively short span of 15 years, evidence-based practice has become ubiquitous in social work as well as in the allied human service professions. However, as shown on this slide, in spite of this popularity, there are a number of issues, controversies, and debates associated with evidence-based practice, as I say, shown on this slide, which time does not permit me to go into, but you can glance at them. Social work then needs to consider the issues shown on this slide as it continues to experiment with moving evidence-based practice from policy and academic worlds into everyday practice. While considerable attention has been given to promoting and conceptualizing evidence-based practice at the policy and direct practice levels, a major challenge remains. That is, to find ways of moving this framework into actual practice to the benefit of the profession's clientele. As the IOM report concludes, while evidence-based practice is widely lauded in government and academic circles, data suggests that it has not yet found its way into actual policy decisions or direct practice. In conclusion, these then are among the macro and micro issues confronting 21st century social workers that I think to be a particularly pressing concern. I would encourage social workers to engage in fresh and innovative thinking about policy and practice options needed to address 21st century social problems, but also to do this while taking into account the profession's history. These options should be assessed through the value prism of the extent to which each option would further the goals which the profession embraces, namely social justice, equality, economic and social security for all, not some, social inclusion, solidarity, and social integration for all, human rights, the worth and dignity of all people, and self-determination. It is through innovation infused with these values that social work will impact macro and micro practice for the benefit of our clients in the 21st century. And it is through such value-based innovation that, in the words of my dear friend James R. Dumpson, social work can contribute to a truly caring society. Thank you. I look forward to discussion. How much time do we have for discussion?
Yes. Oh.
We're going to kick things off with an online question, if that's okay. I'm over here. Sorry. That's why I'm on the computer. So this is coming in from our audience. We have an audience connecting online. So Jennifer Bellamy has asked the question, what do you think social work should be doing to better position itself to have an impact on some of these major social problems? And thank you to Jennifer.
Thank you, Jennifer. It's good to hear that you're out there. Jennifer was one of my doctoral students, along with Karun Singh is here, Jennifer Maglabosco, others. Wow, that's a big question. I really think that a couple of things that need to be done is we are on the trail. We are clearly, as I've implied, we are on the way to evidence-based policy and practice. We're not there yet. Agencies, social work practitioners need to be empowered to respect and to use data-based and data-driven interventions and develop policies that are data-based and data-driven. How that's to be done is the challenge before the profession at this point. There are obviously some things that need to be done. One is resources. There's a resource issue here. It takes time to learn these new methods and these new processes. Agencies need to be able to, government agencies and private agencies need to be able to find ways of empowering their manpower, their women power to engage in this type of practice. That means perhaps short-term investments for long-term payoffs. I also think that another very promising strategy is a partnership strategy between academia and agencies so as to bridge the gap that too much exists here. There are wonderful resources in our universities, not just in schools of social work, but in other disciplines. They should be partnered with agencies in the community. There should be a bridging of that gap. That's critical. That's essential. I think those are two key things I would emphasize.
Please just use your microphone when you ask questions.
Dr. Mullen, thank you so much. That was excellent. With the convergence of, and you've kind of alluded to it in your speech, number one, the collapse of the political middle. We see that's happening. And then you alluded to it, the collapse of the middle class. And then in addition, you put a third overlay with the tremendous corruption within New York State and nationally. Don't you think as social workers we should be more involved in the political arena?
Thank you so much for that question. That is a point I wanted to make. Maybe we'll elaborate on it this afternoon a little bit. I've just been struck one of the reasons I stress the history of social work and our values and our mission as a profession. I've been struck, in preparing today's talk, again struck by how social work is unique among professions. We have eyes on both the macro and the micro levels when we're concerned about social problems. And too often, our educational systems and we ourselves channel us into either the micro or the macro. And that cuts at the heart of the profession. We need skills at the micro level. We need skills at the macro level. But we need a mindset that is constant, that keeps us thinking like social workers. We need to be thinking about the individual mother whose husband is incarcerated and what's going to happen when he gets out of prison and how he's going to reintegrate. But at the macro level, we need to be thinking about what are these institutions all about? What policies need to be put in place to reform these institutions? How do you make it truly real that these are rehabilitation programs and not punishment programs? Social workers are uniquely positioned to do that individually and collectively because they're thinking in both ways. But I think that's a tremendous challenge for social work education and practitioners, is how do you develop the individual skills that you need to do your job, but to keep your mindset organized around both micro and macro dimensions and organized with others perhaps to carry out some of these things. Does that answer your question?
Again, I guess alludes to the political. That's where I was really kind of head to. I know politically social workers are represented. There are Congress people who are social workers. There are state level people. But I guess what I'm saying, I think there needs to be more of that because of what you're alluding to. I think social workers have a unique perspective that is not shared by any other profession near the group. So I think we need to be in the public arena. Like I thought, I think we need to bear witness because I think the public arena is not aware of what we see.
Yeah, I agree totally. And one of the themes that I tried to stress today is how during certain political periods and cultural periods, there has been great progress in social welfare and social work programs and policies. They happen to be in the liberal periods. They happen to be in periods that were primarily Democratic administrations were in control. And much of what has been happening under the more conservative agenda is an attempt to pull back. We see that now, right? AFDC is no longer an entitlement. Mothers are no longer entitled to receive economic support for more than 2 years. And in some states, they're rolling it back to 1 year. There's an attempt to roll back food stamps, and there's an attempt to roll back practically all social welfare programs and replace them with work programs. So yes, social work needs to be out there collectively to fight these attempts to cut back and also to expand. Wouldn't it be nice if we could get into a mindset of expanding our social welfare policies again rather than just defending what we have?
Yeah.
That answered the question. Thanks.
You just use your mic, whoever speaks first.
Hi, I don't know if I'm next or not.
That's all right. You spoke up.
Okay. Thank you so much. You really made me think along a lot of lines, and I have a lot of thoughts, but I'll just limit it because there are so many other people here. One thing, a couple of things that came to my mind are the following. When we identify the problem in terms of the poverty of the few, I think we may be limiting ourselves. What about the greed of everyone? What about focusing on that, the greed of everyone? And maybe we could get some other perspectives and other ways of intervening. And what about the use of art within the practice? What about the things that we cannot scientifically, shall we say, identify in terms of evidence-based? Because so many people, you know, in terms of your overall concept of a caring society, caring comes across through empathy, not necessarily through being able to fill out a statistical sheet.
Yes. I couldn't agree with you more, and thank you for bringing up that point. Given our limited time, I want to refer you. I recently wrote a blog for Oxford University Press. It's online, Oxford Blogs, and I was asked to. I'm editor-in-chief for an Oxford University Press series, and I was asked to write a blog, and I decided to take the topic of, is social work art or science? And the blog looks at this historically, and raises the issues. My own position, of course, is that fundamental to social work, whether it be at the micro or the macro level, is relationship. That's fundamental. And often there's a misunderstanding of evidence-based practice that it is replacing what our strengths already are. We have tremendous strengths, relationship skills, and the ability to empathize and be sensitive and caring. And I think the important understanding is that social work is both art and science, and that evidence-based practice requires both. You have to have good relationship skills if you're going to help your client with a good intervention that's shown to be effective. Without the relationship skills, without the sensitivity, forget it.
Yeah.
Is that your, I think that's
Thank-
something you were saying.
Thank you so very much. It's a wonderful presentation. Very briefly, what will be your recommendations to many of us who have taught in the school, but now to the students and to teach that kind of concept? What is your recommendation? Because generally, you just zero into the aspect that you are teaching, but how do you integrate that into this concept?
So, Professor Guardian is raised an important point. There is a challenge, and I didn't mention it, but I have said that evidence-based practice is the new paradigm. There's so much acknowledgement of it at the policy level and in academia. And I've said that the challenge is how do you implement this at the practice level. I would only say there's a challenge. How do you integrate it at the educational level as well? Yeah. Some of us have done that. There is more educational material available now. I have Oxford Bibliographies Online, which is a very valuable resource. I've authored 3 bibliographies that are now available in Oxford University Press Bibliographies Online that are on evidence-based practice, how to locate evidence for evidence-based practice, and issues and controversies regarding evidence-based practice. There are also bibliographies there online for a wide range of other evidence-based practice approaches, group work, et cetera, et cetera. So I would say we need to develop resources, Teresa, like that, bibliographies that can be used in classrooms.
Exactly.
And that's readily available. So take a look at those as an example. That's one example.
Could I ask,
how much time we have left?
could I just ask, what are the evidence-based practices? I mean, I know about cognitive behavioral, dialectical, but what is it specifically you're referencing to?
Yes, good question. If you go back to that slide, if you talk to the average person out there, when you say evidence-based practice, they're going to say, oh, that equals a treatment intervention like motivational interviewing or interpersonal therapy that have been shown to be effective with certain populations for certain problems. The other evidence was gathered in one or more well-designed field experiments, right? But this slide is really trying to stress something else. It's really a process. And what I do with my students is I teach them the process. They need to answer the question that you've raised. They need to have a client in mind or a hypothetical type of client in mind. They need to know how to ask a question about what your options are with that client. They need to have the skills now readily available online to go to any number of clearinghouses. They need to know where to find those clearinghouses. They need to be able to go into those clearinghouses, identify the ever-changing set of interventions that might be appropriate. They need to be able to critically assess that and then select the intervention with their client and assess what happens when they're used and be ready to ingest. It's a process.
Can I ask?
Evidence-based research tested effective practices. They are things to be used in the process. So I'll refer you again, Oxford Bibliographies Online to my article. If you Google Oxford Bibliographies, and I believe through Columbia, you're able to access them as an alumni through the library. Go take a look at 3 entries on evidence-based practice. I've got one in there, evidence-based practice, where to find the evidence. That's going to give you a whole variety of different places to go. Like the Department of Justice has a wonderful clearinghouse for effective interventions in the criminal justice area. The best clearinghouse that I know for child welfare is the California Evidence-Based Clearinghouse, which is California Child Welfare Evidence-Based Clearinghouse. And it rates a whole range of interventions that are appropriate for any child welfare setting and so forth.
Thank you so much, Professor Mullen. We're going to have to conclude this portion, but before, just wanted to acknowledge you with a round of applause.